Hey, everybody. Steve Marchand here for another Substack Live at lunch. Happy Veterans Day. And obviously, to anybody who happens to be watching or will watch the recording of this later, for all those who have served and to the families of those who support our folks in uniform, the biggest thank you one could possibly give. My wife is a Navy brat, and my family was not active military, but hers very much was. And to see and to hear the stories of their life as they moved frequently, as he served at different parts around the globe, um, there's a lot of sacrifice made by the family, every bit as much as it is by those who served themselves. So, could not give more appreciation on this Veterans Day and appreciate all those who are taking a little time to talk some civics, to talk some politics, and to talk some policy. And there's nobody better to do it than my longtime friend. And I'm going to let Tom, I don't want Tom to have to do all the bragging himself. Tom is one of the most sophisticated political professionals I know. That's how we originally met over 20 years ago. Tom knows policy cold. Tom has a bold streak in him that I know him to go for it and do the right thing. And right now we need to try to do the right thing, and at the state and federal level. And so I want to introduce my friend, State Representative. That sounds good, Tom Oppel. Tom, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I didn't realize your wife's family was Navy. Um, having served 8 years as chief of staff to the Secretary of the Navy in the Obama administration, and my oldest son is a second class petty officer in the Navy. So
Wow.
and you're absolutely right. In many ways, the families of those who put on uh, our nation's cloth um, have a tougher job in many ways. So I just echo, um, a salute to everyone who is serving or has served, and all of their family members, because they really do serve as well.
So, Tom, I want to jump right in, given that. Talk to me a little bit about how you ended up serving in this key role for the Secretary of the Navy, and you were there for quite a while. Just mentioned that. How did that come to be, and what was that experience like?
As you may recall, I started my career. Well, I started my career as a sixth grade English teacher in Hudson. And because teachers are so underpaid then and now, I started working part time as a stringer for the National Telegraph. Became a full time journalist. Covered the New Hampshire legislature and New Hampshire politics for a number of years, and then ultimately ended up going to Mississippi as a journalist. There was an opportunity and to do statewide politics, and as a English major who was a fan of Faulkner and Eudora Welty and Richard Wright, and as well as Southern politics, which is perhaps among the more interesting politics in our country. It was a great opportunity. So I did that for 2 years. And then ultimately, as my friends in journalism said, I went to the dark side and started doing campaigns. And one of the campaigns that I ended up doing was for a 39-year-old Harvard Law graduate who was at the time the state auditor of Mississippi, and he ran for governor, and I was his press secretary. Um, he ultimately won office. I spent a couple of years working for him, went off to do some other campaigns. We remained good friends, and in the Clinton administration, he was offered, where he was nominated and served as ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and tried to get me to go to Riyadh with him, and I turned him down. I had just made partner in a political media consulting firm in D.C. Um, and then when he campaigned on behalf of Barack Obama, uh, I think he was his most traveled surrogate, and he was nominated Secretary of the Navy, and he called me and he said, "You can't turn me down twice." So I ended up going to the Pentagon with him, and we used to joke. He ended up serving the full 8 years. It
Unusual,
was
right? That's pretty unusual.
it was very unusual. It was so unusual that he was the second longest serving Secretary of the Navy uh, since the Woodrow Wilson's administration. Um, and sometimes I used to joke that it felt like we'd been there since World War One. But
I mean,
every
but that is an extraordinarily long time. And one of the most common things you hear from folks, even those who are highly effective and had good relationships throughout their time, is that they basically got burned out well before the end of a second term, often before the end of a first term. So, I mean, what do you think? What allowed him, and by extension, parts of his teams like you, to be able to do that and do it effectively for so long?
I think um, I obviously don't have experience in any other federal agency, thank goodness. Um, uh, but I think the Pentagon is unique in that you essentially have what I used to refer to as the Pentagon Trinity. So you have obviously the uniforms, you have the permanent civilian workforce, the career folks, and then you have people like me who are political, who came in as political appointees. Um, and literally, I spent the first, I would say, I spent the first 4 years learning the job and learning how to negotiate those other, those other power centers, if you will. One of the things that had happened was we have a long tradition, rightly so, of civilian control of the military. Um, but one of the things that I had discovered was that previous secretaries had essentially ceded a lot of their authority um, to the uniforms. Um, and the secretary, according to Title 10 of the Federal Code, has uh, ultimate responsibility to recruit, train, and equip. Um, and so it was important, my boss felt, that we frankly exercised that authority, that he exercised that authority. And so, um, so I spent a good deal of the first 4 years sort of learning the job and figuring out how to, um, reclaim authorities that you know, had been passed down. So it was an interesting first 4 years, and then the second 4 years, it was like, okay, now I've learned the rules of the road, and now we're sort of set up in a better way. And um, it was an incredibly it was a lot of fun. We did a lot of traveling. My boss believes in leadership by walking around. And the Navy and Marine Corps, which is also under the Department of the Navy. If you talk to a Marine, they'll say it's the men's department. Um, but the we have sailors and Marines all over the globe, and we had a reporter one. The secretary did a trip to Mongolia, and a reporter said, why on earth is the Secretary of the Navy going to Mongolia? And the truth was that we had a Marine contingent in there that had been training the Mongolian, uh, military for years and years and years. And as I pointed out to the reporter, Mongolia does live in a very interesting neighborhood given their neighbors.
Sure.
So, so I did about 750,000 miles in 8 years. I did 75 countries, not counting 8 different trips to Afghanistan and probably 5 different trips to Japan and several trips to Europe. So I had a lot of fun, but it was also, I think in many ways the most important job I've ever had because obviously you had, you had uh, almost 200,000 sailors and Marines to look after, and and the nation's security. So it was. I thoroughly enjoyed the job, and I kind of regretted leaving. Probably one of the first jobs. At the end of it, I was like, I wish I could stay, but I didn't. I actually walked out of the Pentagon at 11:55 on inauguration day when Trump was inaugurated the first day. I was trying to finalize some things, but I also wanted to make sure that I was not in the building when he got sworn in.
Well, you really did thread the needle on that with a couple minutes to spare. That's pretty good. So you finish up there, and eventually life takes you back where you are in the Upper Valley region of New Hampshire, and you are more recently running for the legislature. So
Yes.
how did that occur? And obviously you won, and it's in the way I've described it to folks is it's in a purple but getting blue pretty quick uh, district and frankly part of the state in a lot of ways. And you're in your first term.
Right.
And how'd you make the decision first time you run for office? Is that correct?
Other than running for the local planning board, yes.
Okay. And how has that experience been? You've advised people at very high levels that were running for office. You've seen it pretty much every way you can. Now you're the candidate. What's the difference?
Um, well, I like it a lot better on the other side of the camera, honestly. uh, the Yeah, I've spent most of my career advising, trying to help people get elected, um, and very honestly, my predecessor, my immediate predecessor, is a good friend, Corinne Mars. Corinne and I served together on the planning board, and she expressed an interest in 22 in running for this seat. Um, and I helped her get elected. Um, but she is the mother of two young children, and really at the end of the um, by the time we got into the second year of the biennium in early in 24, she came to me again and said, I just don't think I can do it again. And so we spent literally months trying to recruit somebody to run. And the day before the filing deadline ended, she said, "You got to do it. Nobody else is stepping up." And so I didn't want to see the seat not have a Democratic nominee. So I somewhat reluctantly signed up. And Corinne and I joke. Um, she actually got more votes in 22 than I got in 24, um, which she constantly points out to me. Um, but my rejoinder is that she had a better campaign manager.
Hey, there it comes around. So it you're about to start your second year of the 2-year term, and you were in the news recently because a lot of folks think that between the end of the session and the first year and the late spring, early summer, often contentious. This one was kind of a down to the wire. Republicans largely arguing with themselves, since they have, for those that may watching that may not know, they have the governor, they have a supermajority in the state senate, a 16-8 supermajority, and they have a solid majority, depending on who shows up and who resigns and so forth. Roughly a low 220s to high 170s kind of majority. So a solid majority, and they have largely been in lockstep when it's really mattered to them. But the budget was a tougher one, but they get through it, and a lot of folks think nothing much happens until you all reconvene in January of the second year of the biennium. But you made news recently, basically trying to get a conversation into the public sphere going that, the Supreme Court, among others, has said, you guys kind of need to figure out how you're going to pay for schools, among other things. And maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I thought it was an important conversation to try to get. Ultimately, Republicans largely said we don't really want to have that right now, but it's a little more complicated than that. Talk a little bit about your thought process and what made some news in the last few weeks.
Sure. So, and this was not unique, but when I was going, I knocked on almost 1,000 doors in 2024 running for office. And at every place where I met a voter, where somebody came to the door and answered it, I was able to have a conversation. Um, it was clear to me that that economic issues, the affordability issue, and in particular, the impact of property taxes, the burden of property taxes was was number one issue. Um, and and I have talked with colleagues in the House, Democratic colleagues. I've talked with the folks at the state party. I've talked to House leadership. It has been my belief that the Democratic Party in New Hampshire needs to be the party of property tax relief. Um, we the property tax. It's this crazy notion that we're going to make people who are least able to pay the most in terms of the burden on their wallets. Um, you know, um, so uh, so essentially, the House has a rule, uh, 36E to be specific, that says if a bill has been defeated in the first year of the biennium, and we're elected to 2-year terms. So in the first year of the biennium, if the House has acted and defeated a bill, that you cannot reintroduce it in the second year of the biennium. And they're good. You don't want to rehash,
Yes.
uh, inflation that's already been acted upon. Um, but in this case, uh, what Republicans have done in the last 10 years, and the Nonpartisan New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute has put out data. But what they've done is they have cut taxes that basically benefit the wealthiest companies and individuals in our state. 75% of the business taxes are paid by multinational corporations that don't need a tax cut. They've cut probably almost $1 billion in on business taxes. They eliminated the interest and dividends tax, and you had to have you know uh, a huge amount of interest and dividends income to even have a bill, to even have any liability whatsoever. And I'd go to folks in my district and say, do you have $200,000 in interest and dividends? Yeah, and people would laugh at me. Of course you don't, and neither do I. So the interest and dividends tax, basically, uh, only 9 out of 10 people didn't even know it because they didn't have to pay it. They had
Yep.
no liability.
Yep.
And 1% of the population was paying the lion's share of the interest and dividends tax. So, from my perspective, it's like we're putting more burden on property taxpayers, many of whom are on fixed income. And, as property values go up and up and up, they have no means of dealing with that. So I thought we should turn it around. So there was a bill offered by a colleague of mine on the House Ways and Means Committee, Tom Schamberg and Wilma, that would have restored the cuts that have been made in the last 10 years. And given the fact that we now had these two Supreme Court decisions, and in the Kentucky Valley case, commonly known as Conval, and in the Rand case, basically, which, as you well know, Steve, the first Claremont decision was in 1993.
Yep.
I don't think you'd even gotten to Syracuse yet, right?
I think I was a freshman.
Okay,
Think about
all
that.
right.
Now my kids are finishing college.
That's right. So there are people, there are citizens in New Hampshire who were born the first year we had a court decision that said the way you fund public education, based on the lottery of the zip code you're born into,
Yep.
is nuts, and it's, oh, by the way, unconstitutional. It's not just a bad idea; it's against the law. So for 30 years, so people who were born the first time the court said where how you're funding public education is wrong are now in their early 30s and probably have kids who are starting in public education. Um, so anyway, so what I did was I went to the Rules Committee and said, for purposes of dealing with property tax relief and the two court decisions that came down after the legislature had finished our first session. Those decisions came down in the summer. I thought that was a sufficient reason to permit this one bill to be reintroduced. And unfortunately, um, uh, I I couldn't even get the four Democrats on the Rules Committee to make a motion to at least begin the conversation. I knew, I knew that getting approval from the Rules Committee, which is dominated by Republicans as the majority party, I knew I wasn't going to win, but I was hoping that I could at least have begin the conversation. Um, so, um, so anyway, the Rules Committee didn't listen. As far as I'm concerned, that's not the end of the conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, to your point, there's a battle in New Hampshire that's ongoing about which party will be seen as the defender of the property taxpayer, right? When you look at polling and New Hampshireites are asked what's the biggest problem facing New Hampshire, they pretty much say three things. And I know, Tom, we've talked about this.
Right.
They talk about housing, they talk about property, they talk about taxes, which in New Hampshire, for most people, means property taxes. And then they're worried about the quality and the stability of their local public school. And it's the same, basically the same anxiety described three different ways, depending on where you are in the life cycle and what town you live in and so forth. And then you add, as you say, this layer of yet another state Supreme Court decision that has said in no uncertain terms that the state is not fulfilling its minimum requirement in terms of the funding of public school. So even uh, a growing number of Republicans, in their own, I would argue, unorthodox ways, are beginning to acknowledge at least that there is this pressure that they're going to have to do something about. And what the something is will be throwing some stuff on the wall, right? So, like, there's a gentleman who's a state representative in Sullivan County, a Republican, who has said, you know what, we do need more money. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll just quadruple the statewide property tax rate, and then we'll throw some exemptions in to try to smooth it out, and that'll generate and towns have to give back the excess, which right now they don't have to, which would at least make it statewide rather than sort of a local tax called state. We call it even. So that to me is one of the first acknowledgments from the Republicans. I don't think it's going anywhere. That they're like, crap, we probably do have to come up with something. And because, I mean, the numbers are the numbers, and the anger on taxes, schools, and housing is not getting it's the heat is going up, not down. There's no evidence it's going to reverse in the next few years in some natural way. So one of these two parties is going to own the mantle of providing answers, providing an explanation and a solution. And I found it very interesting that what you were doing, at least from my perception, was trying to posit both the problem and a solution, a partial solution.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And look, uh, Terry Spilsbury is the rep in Charlestown, um, who introduced that bill. And while I don't agree with that approach, I give Terry credit for at least recognizing there's a problem and we need to talk about solutions. And you know, I don't agree with his approach, but I appreciate the fact that he's at least recognizing that we have a problem and is offering a solution. I think it's not a great one, but at any rate, at least I think he's trying to start a conversation, and I may not be helping Terry by by
Yeah.
giving him credit. Yeah,
Tom Oppel gives credit.
yeah,
Bill
yeah,
goes down in flames.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. I remember when I was the first 2 years when I was in Mississippi, still as a journalist. Um, I, I there was a conversation in which um, this state senator went up to another state senator and said, "I'll be for your bill or I'll be against your bill, whichever will help you more." Um, but yeah, I think that, and look, Jason Osborne, the Republican majority leader in the House, is now talking about putting a leash on
Yes.
local control. And what he's really talking about, I mean, let's call it what it is. he is basically taking away the right of citizens to vote on budgets in their own communities because he's saying, I know better than you. So I dare him to come to Canaan and say that to the Canaan folks, to Canaan folks about, I'm going to take your vote away. I don't think, no, I shouldn't say, I know that will not go over very well. So I think, I do think that we have an opportunity. Look, I think it is a good political solution. And what makes it even better is it's the right moral solution as well. We need to do something for property taxpayers to take the heat off, and we need to do something to support our public schools and our students. And I often use, or I should say, I often steal from you something I heard a long time ago about the street where one side of the street in Portsmouth
Yes.
is in one school area, send their kids to one
Elementary
school.
district, yeah.
Right. And across the street, it's a different one. One is perceived as better than the other, and the difference is reflected in property values. So there's an economic component to this too. And the last thing I'll say on this issue is, I tell people all the time, I'm not getting any younger. And this is not a shot at you, Steve, but my hair is pretty gray. And the fact is, you can go a lot longer looking younger than I can.
I think I would be gray, but who will know?
Exactly. So in a sense, you're going to get away with it for a lot longer.
Oh yeah.
But New Hampshire is the second oldest state by population in the country, and we're getting older, and we are not doing anything to either retain or attract young people. And as a result, I tell people there's gonna, we are in a demographic time bomb where it's going to be a situation where essentially, will the last young person who leaves New Hampshire turn out the lights? We're going to end up, folks like my age, we're going to end up in nursing homes with no one to take care of us because we shortchanged public education, we shortchanged higher education. We didn't do, we didn't solve the housing crisis.
Yep.
As I tell people, I'm on the planning board in my town of Canaan. We do not have comprehensive townwide zoning. So all year long, I kept hearing about, well, the way to solve the housing crisis is to deregulate. And I said, well, you know what? We have a housing shortage in Canaan too. What do you want to deregulate? Because we don't have zoning. So it's not just, it's not just about deregulation. It's not, there are no simple answers other than the fact that we have to recognize that there are some things you simply have to pay for.
Well, and when we talk about the investment, I think there are a lot of towns. My town in Northampton, where I live on the seacoast, is one such example where if a town, because we rely more on local property taxes than any state in the country, when a family with a school-age kid moves into town, it's an uh-oh moment, particularly for a small town, which has kind of a small denominator to play with, particularly if it's a family that has a kid with eligibility for special education, their own IEP, and that cost can easily go into six digits for a district that in some cases, the district will have barely 100 students in it, and all of a sudden it's added a significant percentage. And so they have to come up with ways to cap the number of kids that could plausibly live in the district. And it leads to all these weird unintended consequences that even the most permissive zoning reform efforts of the last few years, and there have been some bipartisan ones, some of which I support. But for example, if you don't have the water and wastewater infrastructure to be able to plug in additional housing into it, if everybody's going to have their own septic, it puts a practical cap that's actually quite limited on the numbers. It puts a real cap on multi-unit residences because of the septic need. That alone will kill it right there. So there are, I guess the legal language would be effective prohibition, where you don't explicitly prohibit it, but you use infrastructure limitation to make sure that it puts a very limited cap. So you can put all the laws in that you want. And if you can't plug in and you got to put septic in, you got a really low cap. And I don't think that really any of the bills that I've seen, again, some of which I think have some good ideas to them. Many of them have an interesting bipartisan angle, but they don't really get into that, and that costs money. Which as you learned trying to reinvigorate a conversation about revenue, that doesn't go over well, even to pay for what the Supreme Court has said we have to pay for, much less to incentivize local governments to make the investments that might lead to more housing.
Well, and the other thing is, um, and this is something I simply don't understand. There is no doubt in my mind, and I don't think anybody in this country would argue with me. This is historically the greatest country in the world, and has been the freest country in many cases. Um, I think that's changing, not for the better, but we're certainly the most prosperous country in human history. How did we get there? We didn't get there with private schools. We didn't get there with voucher programs. We got there with a robust public education system nationwide, was the envy of the world. We got there, by accepting uh, people. Ronald Reagan in his last speech was talking about, if you move to France, you don't become a Frenchman. If you move to China, you don't become Chinese. If you move to America, you become an American. And that's, you look at the Silicon Valley and the kind of, amazing stuff that, technology. Many of those people are immigrants or the children of immigrants.
Oh yeah.
So, I don't understand what is happening when all of the things that made this country as great and as prosperous as it is, we're now sort of trying to turn our back and turn back the clock. Um, I mean, my grandmother grew up in Lynn, Massachusetts, and talked about the signs "No Irish Need Apply."
Yep.
So I'm 2 generations removed from the kind of discrimination. I know your own family, French Canadian, suffered the same sort of discrimination. Maybe sometimes it was understated, or
Yep.
but still it was there. Um, and so, it just boggles my mind that we have this idea, and we're creating this circumstance in which, as you say, and I've certainly had this conversation with people in my community who are like, well, uh, you know, we don't want families with kids moving into town, because it costs us more. And it's like, and I say to them, well, you know what the cost is going to be if you don't have a workforce? You're not going to have businesses. You're not going to have jobs, and the tax burden is going to come back on you. So, you've got to understand that, look, it's basic biology. If you're not growing, you're dying. And you know this as well as anybody. The reason we have old home days of celebration was because back in the 30s, so many people were leaving the state, and I forget the name of the governor who came up with the idea, but it was basically to try and attract people back to New Hampshire, because we were losing population. I remember, as I'm sure you do, when those mills in Manchester that are now, thank goodness, filled with new businesses and technology companies and university systems. But I remember a time in the 70s and 80s and 90s when those buildings were empty. And they were a testament to, when I went to Mississippi, people were, talking about attracting business with tax incentives. And, well, we'll just tell them they don't have to pay taxes for 10 years. And it said, well, that textile industry that used to be in Manchester, New Hampshire, is now in South Carolina, but is headed to Southeast Asia.
Yep.
Because they're chasing the cheap dollar. So that went way off. course there.
No, that's all right. That's all right. Hey, this is what they call long form. It's also live. People like live, you know. So I want to tap into you alluded to this in your bio, your work in national politics, among other things, helping develop messaging for candidates, including federal candidates. So we scheduled this about a week ago, and sometimes it feels like in politics, a week, it feels like a year or something. And of course, a tremendous amount has occurred at the national level just in the last week. Notably, in the last 48 hours, this deal brokered by about 8 Democrats with the Republicans that appears poised to reopen the government in the next couple of days. A lot of Democrats very upset, and the grassroots. I think you've probably seen a lot of that. Where, how do you see how it went down? And as we now are in the back half of the 2 year cycle, we're closer to the 26 election than the 24 election. What's the Democratic message as we turn the corner towards 2026?
Well, here's what I think the Democratic message ought to be, and
Yeah.
that's about affordability. And you talked about, and I'm absolutely true. Education, housing, property taxes, big issues here in New Hampshire. I would add, and I know in your Substacks and some other things you've talked about this as well, healthcare, particularly given the fact that as Democrats, it's one of the few areas where the people trust us more than they trust the Republicans on the healthcare issue, which is why I think what the Senate, what the Democratic Senate caucus was trying to do with the government shutdown was was highlight the issue with healthcare. And the fact of the matter is, um, the the we know the subsidies are going to end, and so healthcare costs are going to go through the roof. And what's going to happen is more people are going to get sick. It's going to cost more to try and cure them or save them. They're going to end up in ERs. It's going to be uncompensated care, which means all of us who have insurance, who are lucky enough to be able to afford insurance, are going to end up paying more. That's just basic economics. And I don't understand why, um, we hear this, for example, all the time about, the reason CEOs need to make tens of millions of dollars is because that's what it takes to attract them. Um, and yet somehow that same economics doesn't work for the minimum wage worker. It's like, people will say, well, we can't find good employees. Well, maybe if you offered a little bit more money, you could solve that problem. It's just like the CEO. So I think fundamentally the Democratic message needs to be focused back on, as my friend James Carville said famously in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. Um, it is about economic issues, and I think, um, I don't mean to, and I don't believe Democrats should walk away from civil rights issues, whether it's the LGBTQ community or transgender folks, but they're in this economy too, and they're suffering just as much as everybody else when they go to the grocery store. They try to fill up their car. Um, Everybody's impacted by the economy. And as I told several of my progressive friends in the House, goes back a couple months. I said, my view is the only people who aren't marginalized in this country these days are billionaires. Everybody else is struggling, and I don't care what color you are, what religion you are, what race you are. Um, if you're a middle class or working class person, you're struggling, and you're probably doing paycheck to paycheck and worried about one crisis happening. So I think our message has to be that. I think unfortunately the shutdown, obviously no shutdown is ever good. As my own son was worried, in the Navy, was worried about getting paid, um, and we were trying to talk him through that. But I think one of the things it demonstrated was it highlighted the healthcare issue, um, and it put a spotlight on that issue in a way that hadn't been done before. And very honestly, I think it also put a spotlight on just how cruel this president is and how partisan he is. Um, the fact that he's talking about punishing blue states and punishing programs that he thought benefited Democrats. He's the president of the United States, not the president of the Republican Party, not the president of MAGA. And he didn't recognize it in the first term, and it's only gotten worse. But I do think that it highlighted the cruelty. And even Trump himself was talking last week about how the shutdown was hurting Republicans far more than Democrats. Not that it should be a strictly partisan issue; it shouldn't be. But I think I think people were recognizing what was at stake, and I think we caved. I think we folded. At least some of the Senate folded enough to sort of give the Republicans. Essentially, I think we were sitting there with a full house, and instead of continuing to play, we just chose to fold our cards and walk away from the table.
So, one of the most common questions I'm hearing from my Democratic friends, my activist friends, is why now? Why not 3 weeks ago? Why not 3 weeks from now? Why do you think it happened when it did and the way it did?
And I don't know that I got a good answer for that, Steve. I will say, you and I were talking a little bit before we started. Um, I was in the Pentagon in 2013 for another shutdown. And frankly, at the time, um, I thought we had pretty much not just a winning hand. We frankly had the other side um, between a rock and a hard place. And then um, the then Vice President, Joe Biden, went up to the Hill and negotiated essentially a get out of jail free card for the Republicans. They essentially there were some deadlines coming up that would have forced uh, a good decision as far as that shutdown. And essentially, what happened was he negotiated away those deadlines. Um, and it just I don't know. We seem to have we seem to keep bringing pop guns to gunfights. Um, we're just we we just I don't think I think the look one of the things that's happened. Credit to Wendy Thomas, the state rep from Merrimack.
Yep.
Back in the late winter, as as Republican members of U.S. Congress were holding town meetings and getting basically chased out of their own meeting by angry voters, Wendy said, "Well, we should be doing this. We should be doing listening sessions." And a small group of us, or about half a dozen of us, work with Wendy, and we're coming up on uh, probably sometime in January, we will hold the 50th listening session. We've had them all over the state. And at every single one, much like what you're hearing when you go talk to Democratic groups, we hear people who expect us to be fighting for what for their priorities and their values. And that's what we're trying to do. It's tough when you have a 40-seat deficit in the House, but like going to the Rules Committee, the best we can do is try to highlight these issues as much as we can. And I think we were doing a great job, of highlighting what was at stake in the shutdown. I hope the folks who oppose this deal, including our two congresspersons, Representative Goodlander, Representative Pappas, both have come out and said they're not going to vote for them.
Well, it would seem like we may end up in a pretty similar vote, at least on the closing of the government, early in 2026, right? Aren't we talking about a rather short-term extension as a way to reopen this week?
Yeah, it's as I understand it, and I don't know the exact date, but as I understand it, it only goes into January. and it may go to the end of January. But yeah, you're right. I think we're going to be back. We're going to be back in this circumstance. The problem is at that point, the subsidies will have expired, and
Right.
so people are going to be facing, you know, pretty significant increases just to keep their health insurance. And as you know, what will happen is the youngest people and the healthiest people will opt out of the program. They'll say, you
Right.
know, your kids and my kids, you know, if well, my son is about to turn 26, but he's in the Navy, so he's healthcare is pretty much taken care of for him. But young, healthy people will be saying, "Well, I can't afford that. I'm gonna take my chances that you know, like when I was in my 20s, I thought I was immortal and you know bulletproof, and so they're going to opt out, which is going to leave older, less healthy people in the system, which means more claims are going to be filed, which means insurance companies are going to go, whoa, wait a second, we're not making enough money here. And so the premiums are just going to keep going up and up and up. And it's a death spiral in many ways. So, but, you know, we'll be revisiting this argument back in come January.
And I do think even within the Democratic primaries that begin as early as next March or so in a handful of states around the country, I think Illinois is March, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to be starting to get there pretty quick, and with a lot of congressional primaries, a handful of interesting U.S. Senate primaries, where so far it seems like within the Democratic base, almost universality of opposition to the deal. I'm seeing very little nuance. And of course, there is some nuance to all this, right? If it
Oh,
was
sure.
easy, decisions would have been made one way or the other 6 weeks ago. Um, but I
I
was
tell my
looking for
kids,
fissures.
I tell my kids all the time, I can hear my father's voice saying, you know, I learned a lot of things from him, but one of the things I remember, and I can hear his voice saying, there are always two sides to every story. And, you know, and now my kids are repeating it back to me. The, the problem that I've learned in my years is it's not just two sides, it's probably 27.
Oh, there are many. What's the old saying? Ask five lawyers their opinion, you'll get seven opinions, or something like
Yeah,
that.
right, right. Or ask five economists, and you'll get you know six opinions. Right.
Right, that's right. So I do think that there will be near unanimity within. For example, here in New Hampshire, we have a first CD primary. We have a U.S. Senate primary, and this could be an opportunity for a fissure that would give voters a selection. But up to this point, in both the Senate and the House, I'm not seeing, certainly in a public facing way, any significant fissure in how it's being perceived. So, and I see the same thing around the country. It will be interesting if we end up in late January with another shutdown looming. At that point, you know, I do wonder. Look, one thing about Donald Trump is, you know, I mean, I don't know if this counts as art of the deal, but I believe that he had begun putting that additional pressure to eliminate the filibuster, at least in this circumstance. And one could argue, and I am sympathetic to this, that when the decision was made at the get go to push for the shutdown without some kind of a concession, that the concession, it had to be a big enough concession that it would mean something, like ACA subsidy
Right.
continuation. But the bigger the concession was, the less likely it was going to be to ever be put on the table under any circumstance. And so I think the base is so hungry for the fight that the Senate, I think, felt compelled to engage the fight without necessarily having an exit strategy ready to go. And then, you know, 6 weeks later, it was pretty obvious that Trump was willing to let a lot of people get in an awfully uncomfortable place, beyond the place where I think even a lot of past Republican presidents might have been willing to go. And then Trump goes, I'll tell you what, before I give in, I'm going to lean on enough senators. We're just going to get rid of the filibuster. And I do get the sense at that point that a growing number of Democratic senators probably were like, I'm not sure how this ends, but I don't think it ends well, and I don't think it ends soon. And it's that, and and then it becomes a temperament thing. It becomes a not even moderation of politics, but sort of moderation of institutionalist more than moderate. I think it's how do you see the Senate? What is the role of the Senate? What is the comity of the Senate? And that sort of thing. Because I'm not sure it's purely. There are some rather moderate Democratic U.S. senators who vote no on this, and there are some that vote yes on this. And I think in January we may get another opportunity to understand better where the fissures maybe lie in a way that we don't right now. But at least for a few months, you know, that seems like something we won't be talking about too much.
Well,
Um,
and I will say this, and there are pros and cons. Um, but I am not just a big D Democrat. I'm a small D Democrat. Um, and unlike some of the founding folks, um, I just watched, and I will highly recommend. There's a new series out on Netflix about James Garfield, um,
Is it?
and it's very well done, very well acted, and it focuses on Garfield and the person who shot him. And the fact is, the series makes clear Garfield died not because of the gunshot, but he died because of the infection that was created because the doctor who was attending to him was a quack. Um, but the interesting thing is, um, it highlights as well the pre-direct election of U.S. senators. Um, and
Oh,
I am just I am a big believer. I think the electoral college, where you have the situation, um, Madison originally proposed proportional representation in both chambers and lost that battle. But the fact that South Dakota and North Dakota, with a tenth of the population of California, have twice as many senators is just ridiculous. We have this government essentially it's a minority government, um, and so I'm not a big fan of the filibuster. And I recognize that right now, as a big D Democrat, it's probably preserving some things that are important.
right.
But I just think fundamentally it's wrong. In the same way that I think, the Supreme Court, the two most egregious decisions in the last 10 years are giving the president immunity and from prosecution and putting him above the law.
Yeah.
Along with the decision that said instead of one person, one vote, we're going to go to $1, one vote.
Yeah.
So Jeff Bezos is always going to be able to outvote you and me. That's wrong. Um, your voice shouldn't depend on how many dollars you have in your bank account. Your voice should depend on your voice. Period. So Citizens United is just awful. But again, I've detoured away.
Well, that's okay. It's funny when we look at all of this mid-decade redistricting, and some of it higher profile than others, but there's a lot of states that are tweaking. Even it's funny, even Utah just was in the news this morning because it's going to retain a Democratic seat. It appears in all likelihood that they were trying to draw out. But as if instead of trying to move away from the electoral college style of you're all in or you're all out, you're all red, you're all blue, and we're actually seem to be moving the congressional seats towards an electoral college style where if you are a red state, even if it's a 55-45 red state, there's no chance. We're totally evacuating the idea that different parts of your state should get different kinds of representation based on the unique wrinkles that make each state wonderful and unique. Well, now we're at a place where, and both parties are doing it. The Democrats as a direct response to, avoid unilateral disarmament here. But we're going to end up with, if your state has 12 electoral votes, it's gonna end up with, and I get that in that scenario, that would be what, 10 members of Congress, right? I believe. So like
Yeah,
we're gonna end up, we're not gonna have any more 5-5s. They're gonna be 8-2-9-1s in either direction. And so it's like the red states are gonna be also the red congressional seat. And to be honest, I mean, when I look at one of the underreported stories, it's not so far away anymore. When you look at the redrawing of the reapportionment of the seats after the 2030, it sure looks like we're heading to some pretty serious math problems for Democrats, where the population is moving to the south and moving out of some of the traditional bluer states in the north and the northeast. That would make a real difference in the electoral college starting in 2032, right? I mean, that's where we're going.
yeah, exactly. And that's my point. A real democracy means that everybody has the same chance, same opportunity to influence decisions as anybody else. And you want to organize, but somehow, both parties have been moving away from the unit rule where, if you had 10 members of your or 11 members of your delegation and six voted one way and five voted the other, all of your votes went to were controlled by the six. um, that's wrong. The fact that the Supreme Court has seen fit to gut what I think is one of the great pieces of legislation and democratizing and fulfilling a promise that we made, a couple of hundred years ago, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is I think one of the greatest pieces of legislation ever invented by humans, frankly, not just Americans. And this Supreme Court is piece by piece dismantling it. And so we're saying that, there are certain populations that just aren't as important. I think that's wrong. I think it's un-American. And I think we need to call it out to that.
Well, I see as we approach 1 o'clock, uh, I, you're making me think there's a lot of work to do
There is
at the
there's
national and
always
state level, and it's all connected, right?
that's right.
I mean,
It's
thematically.
always, hey, democracy is not a spectator sport.
It is not, and you have not been a spectator in your entire career. You've pretty much worn about every hat. You've covered it. You've been an elected official. You've helped elected officials. You've served under appointed officials who were elected. I mean, you pretty much you tried to teach the next generation of voters. I mean, you name it, you've probably done it sometime over the last several decades.
I always joke when people look at my resume that there are some people who would say I couldn't keep a job.
You had the same job. It just took different roles. That's all it
Yeah.
was,
Well,
right?
I like your spin on that, Steve. And
Well,
look, the fact of the matter is, you've been there in the trenches and in the spotlight as well. And God bless you for what you're doing with Move the Goalposts, and I enjoy these Substacks, and they've been a lot of fun. The only thing I will quibble with is in your sports podcast when you talk to your friend Joe.
yes.
You gave short shrift to hockey, which is unforgivable.
Oh, I have to say, it is interesting. As much as this is one of the hotbeds of hockey, right? High school, college, obviously the Bruins. It it does seem like of the big four sports in New England, when the Bruins are on top, or yeah, then I'm not sure there's a more exciting fan base. Excited, but exciting. Like I love watching hockey. I think there's no better sport in person to watch than hockey. The
Yeah,
sound,
I agree.
I love it. And the challenge, I think it's always been more of a challenge as a TV sport compared to, say, football, which has basically amended the game over the last half century in the name of becoming a TV sport, where the crowd, I think, often is an accompaniment to the television experience rather than. I mean, look, if you just want to watch the football game, the best way to watch a football game is at home because of the way it's set up. If you want to experience and show up 5 hours early and get a little buzzed and cook some food and like yell and scream, that's awesome. But it's nothing like hockey in terms of going. And I love the sound of people getting checked. I love the sound of the puck, the crowd, the energy. But you're right. It probably got a short shifted on the no pun intended.
I enjoyed the podcast except for that. And I what I wanted to do, and I was listening, it was recorded. So
Yeah.
what I wanted to do was call in and go, wait a second. And I'll just say this quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
I had two boys. I have two boys who both played travel hockey from the time they were 6 or 7. And I know I've heard from other people say, "Oh man, how could you let your kids? You're getting up at 6 a.m. and you're doing all this stuff." Um, my I would trade anything to go back to the days of taking them to tournaments, taking them to games, taking them to practices. We had so many opportunities to spend time together, quality time in a car,
Yeah.
talking about whatever. And I know it's true, any of those experiences, whether it's athletics or dance or drama, any of those opportunities, if there are young parents listening, do that. Get involved, get your kids involved in something. And, yes, you have to spend a lot of time in a car driving them to things, driving in rehearsals or practices or whatever. But there will be no better time in your relationship with your kids than that. And the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, when my youngest son went to his last high school hockey game, um, it has left such a void in my life, and I miss it. And
Yes.
every chance I get, both boys are now playing in men's leagues and sort of beer league hockey. And I told them both, from the time they started playing, I would consider myself a success as a parent if they were still loving the game and playing the game at 50. And I suspect they will because they both love the game and they both miss it when they don't play.
Is hockey your favorite sport?
It is. Although I'm just old fashioned enough, I still love baseball. So, I'm a diehard Red Sox fan. Um, you know, although the way I like to, I love to sit out on my porch of a summer night and listen to the game on radio. That's to me the way baseball should be enjoyed. I can't watch TV. I love going to games live, um,
Yes.
but and the difference between baseball is such a social sport. There's
Yeah.
there's so many opportunities to have conversations with people around you while there's not a whole lot going on in the field or between innings or whatever. With hockey, it's like I go to a game. I have season tickets at Dartmouth hockey, and I go to a Dartmouth game and I have 2 seats and I invite friends to come join me. But it's like I always tell them, don't talk to me while the game's going on.
Oh,
I'm
we're doing
watching.
business. Oh,
Oh,
yeah. During a
yeah.
Pats game on a Sunday afternoon, particularly during this resurgence, the family knows everybody is more than welcome in, but understand that you're coming into an experience. This is not the watching of a game. This is business. This is identity. This is there's a lot happening. There's 3 sources. There's a little DraftKings maybe going on. If we're being honest, I mean, there's a lot going on. We've got the Sunday tickets, so we've got the 4 games going on. The volume will be on the Pats game, but I'm watching that Cleveland Pittsburgh game. I got my eyes open, and the whole shebang. And it is identity, and I do feel like well, one of the reasons I have the sports podcast is my deep love of sports. Some folks may know I originally went to Syracuse University because it had a great public affairs school for my political and policy chops, but it had probably the best public communication school in the country, the Newhouse School, where
Yep.
most of the big sportscasters went through those halls, and they have the Hall of Fame, and I mean they know what they're doing. And after a year, I realized the sport was the hobby and the politics and policy was the vocation. Still did both programs, but reverse which one was going to be the job I was going to do. And the sports never went away, obviously, and I love it. So the sports podcast is passion. It also, and this is something I say to these Democratic audiences that I frequently meet with, is if we go to our friends who maybe are probably not hardcore Democrats in a lot of cases, family, friends, neighbors. And we try to lean in on get them engaged in Democratic politics with hardcore politics. Not only are they not going to connect, or else they'd already be in the tribe, they actually will be repelled by this foreign culture. So, like, for me, it's sports because it's authentic. If for somebody else, it's hiking or it's being in the choir or it's, training dogs or it's cooking, I don't give a crap. Whatever it is that gives you the passion and you get to be with members of that tribe, that's how you do it. So I tell my friends, some of them, they'll watch the sports podcast or listen on Spotify or Apple iTunes or on my YouTube channel. And then some of them will send me a DM on Twitter later saying, hey, I didn't know that you had the political one. So I came for the sports and I stayed for the politics. And frankly, in the long run, that's a little bit of it. I will say, as we approach the end here, shameless plug that I've got to give. So Friday, we'll be trying something a little different. I'll turn just like this one. This one will lightly edit, turn to a podcast by this evening or tomorrow morning. Friday, I'll be doing my first Substack live on the same channel. It will not be about politics. It'll be about sports. Specifically, there's a very successful Substacker who has a very popular YouTube channel that's called Wax Pack Gods. So wax packs, for those that don't know, baseball cards used to come in 15 in a pack in a wax pack. They would be wrapped in wax, had the bubble gum
with a stick of gum, right?
The stick of gum that would stain the one card at the back. And you would pay your 25 cents, depending when you were doing it, 30 cents. And you would open it up and you didn't know what you were going to get. And there was that excitement. First, the sugar high of the gum that lasted about 20 seconds. You could feel your teeth coming out. And then you'd be like, oh my God, I got a Carl Yastrzemski or a Roger Clemens or a Mookie Betts or a Roman Anthony. The story's the same. And so what
I always use the Yankees card to stick in my bicycle wheels and make the noise that made it sound really cool. But it was always the Yankees that I it's like, oh God, I got another.
The opportunity to ruin a Bucky Dent card was a good day. That's what that in our side of the fence. So
yeah,
we're
for
going
me
to have
it was
him
Mickey
on.
Mantle.
His name's Adam. We're going to have Adam on Friday, and we're going to talk a lot. Every day. It's Wax Pack Gods. It's a lot of fun, and we're going to actually use. I have 50,000 cards plus, and we will go through some of the 1983 Topps baseball cards. He's about my age. He's about 50.
Oh, I think I lost you.